The winter morning in Fairfax County, Virginia, carried a stillness that felt heavier than usual, the kind of quiet that presses against your chest without reason. On January 5, 1999, the streets were damp with overnight frost melting in the weak sun, the scent of wet leaves lingering in the air, and the occasional distant bark of a dog cutting through the silence. It was a Tuesday, a normal day for the residents of the quiet suburban neighborhood, but for one family, it would be the day that nothing would ever be the same again. Aisha Zahra Hussain was 12, small but spirited, a girl with wide, curious brown eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the world around her. She had the kind of smile that lit up rooms, quick and shy, always paired with a quiet laugh. Her hair, black and straight, fell neatly past her shoulders, often caught up in a ribbon when she was busy with schoolwork or helping around the house. Aisha loved the ordinary rhythms of her life. School mornings, homework in the sunlight pouring through the kitchen window, small errands with her mother, and walks through the neighborhood with her friends. Everything about her was a quiet vibrancy, an energy that seemed to ripple softly through the Hussain household. The morning started like any other. The cold air made Aisha rub her hands together as she stepped outside in her modest coat, a small backpack slung over her shoulder, the straps snug against her chest. Her mother, Fatima, called from the doorway, reminding her to be careful on the way to the corner store, a routine errand before school, just a few blocks down the street. Aisha waved, smiled, and promised she would. Fatima didn't watch her leave for long. She had other chores, the kettle boiling, laundry in the next room. Aisha's neighborhood was familiar, a place where children played freely, parents chatted over fences, and neighbors looked out for one another. But even in a place so ordinary, there were edges of unease. That morning, Aisha noticed a man she didn't recognize walking briskly along the street. He kept his gaze low, hands in his pockets, and didn't make eye contact with anyone. It was nothing unusual in a suburban community, but a slight chill ran down her spine. She shrugged it off, told herself he was probably just going to work, just another passerby. Her path to the store was lined with bare trees, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers toward the sky. She waved to Mrs. Patel, who was sweeping her porch, and called a soft hello. Mrs. Patel smiled and waved back. Everything seemed normal. Aisha reached the corner store, greeted the owner, Mr. Thompson, and picked up the bread her mother had requested. The small bell above the door jingled as she stepped out, and she tucked the loaf under her arm. It was on the walk back that things began to shift in ways she couldn't see, in ways no one could. The winter air felt sharper, the streets quieter. She noticed her shoelace had come undone and bent down to tie it. Behind her, the sound of a car engine hummed softly, distant but growing louder. She stood, readjusting her backpack, and began walking again, her steps steady, unaware that someone had been following the rhythm of her movements for several blocks. Aisha passed by her friend Lena's house. Lena waved from the porch, calling out a cheerful hello. Aisha waved back, her own smile genuine. The moment was ordinary, fleeting, a memory of childhood normalcy that would soon be frozen in time. But somewhere nearby, someone's eyes were tracking more than just a passing child. By the time she reached the end of her street, the shadows of the houses stretched long across the pavement. Aisha slowed, sensing that maybe she should hurry, but the day was still early, the sun weak but promising. She glanced at the familiar houses, the fences, the mailboxes. Everything looked as it always had, and yet something was off. A subtle tension that she couldn't name pricked at her senses. She didn't see Mark, her neighbor, and her stepsister's older brother, as he sat in his usual spot by the window, the blinds pulled just so, watching the street. To anyone else, he was a normal man, polite when spoken to, often quiet, usually alone. He had no criminal record, no prior suspicion from neighbors. But that day, the pattern of his solitude would intersect with Aisha's ordinary path, and the world would tilt in ways that no one could anticipate. Aisha turned the corner toward her house. She had almost reached the familiar warmth of her kitchen, the kettle whistling in the background, when someone stepped out from behind a parked car. The moment was brief, a flicker of movement. Aisha froze, heart picking up its pace. The stranger smiled, a polite mask, and in that second the ordinary day shattered. Her next steps were the last anyone would see for months. Aisha's disappearance happened in a blink. A moment when the normal world of school, chores, and neighborhood greetings collided with something dark and incomprehensible. No one saw her taken. No one heard a struggle. It was as if she had simply vanished into the winter air, leaving behind only the echoes of her laughter and the scent of cold streets. Inside the Hussein household, the hours stretched slowly. Fatima noticed her daughter hadn't returned as usual. She called friends, checked the neighbors, walked the street again and again. Anxiety prickled at her chest. By late morning, the worry had sharpened into panic. Calls to the store confirmed Aisha had been there. She had bought the bread, she had left. But after that, no one knew. The unfathomable weight of uncertainty settled into the household. Fatima's husband Imran paced the living room, making calls to anyone who might have seen something, anything. Their home, once warm with routine, now hummed with a tense emptiness. As the day stretched on, neighbors began to gather. The community's concern was immediate, visceral. Children were kept inside, parents searched yards and streets, someone called the police. Detective Harding, a seasoned investigator known for his methodical approach and quiet persistence, was dispatched to the scene. He arrived with the knowledge that missing children cases were delicate, urgent, and devastatingly complex. The air carried an undercurrent of dread, not just for Aisha, but for everyone who would be drawn into the unfolding nightmare. Detective Harding walked the streets with officers, talking to neighbors, mapping Aisha's last known path, and piecing together fragments of observation. Who had seen what? Who might have noticed someone unusual? At first, every detail seemed promising. A glance, a sound, a fleeting movement, and yet by nightfall, the pieces refused to cohere. There were no forced entries, no obvious traces, no signs of struggle. Aisha had vanished as completely as if the winter air itself had swallowed her whole. Inside the Hussein home, the small kitchen clock ticked relentlessly. Fatima clutched her sweater to her chest, staring at the doorway through which her daughter should have returned. Imran's face was pale, eyes bloodshot from hours of pacing and making calls. Every creak of the floorboards, every wind gust rattling the windows felt like it might carry news, good or terrible. But silence persisted, heavy and oppressive. And outside, as the evening shadows fell across the frost-covered lawns, Mark returned from his routine walk. Alone, polite, unnoticed. He carried the normalcy of an ordinary man in a neighborhood where tragedy had just struck, the kind of presence that would haunt a story for years to come, because for all appearances, nothing seemed out of place. But in that normalcy lay the first seeds of horror, the hidden calculus that would cast a decade-long shadow over a community and a family's life. By the end of that first day, the narrative of a normal suburban Tuesday had been irrevocably rewritten. Aisha Zahra Hussein was missing. A community held its collective breath, and Detective Harding, quietly noting every detail, already sensed that this case, simple in appearance, would demand every ounce of his skill, persistence, and humanity. The winter night settled in, streets empty, houses silent, and the Hussein family waited, unaware that the ordinary rhythm of life had fractured, that the long shadow of what had begun would stretch far beyond that single day. The morning after Aisha's disappearance began with the same quiet that had marked the previous day, but now it carried an edge of dread. The streets of Fairfax County seemed to hold their breath, the cold air sharper, each crunch of frost underfoot sounding louder, heavier. The reality that no one had seen Aisha since yesterday morning pressed against every neighbor's thoughts, shaping the rhythm of the day into anxious, unrelenting tension. Fatima Hussein barely slept that night. She sat by the living room window, clutching a blanket, her eyes tracing the familiar outlines of the street, the corner store, the mailbox at the end of the lane, the tree-lined sidewalks. Everything was ordinary, everything unchanged, except for the absence of her daughter. Imran, her husband, had wandered the house aimlessly, calling Aisha's name in low tones that carried into the darkened kitchen, carried into the empty bedrooms, into the hallways that smelled faintly of laundry and cold winter air. Their home had become a waiting room for an answer that refused to arrive. By mid-morning, concern had become alarm. Neighbors, who at first assumed the child was delayed by errands or school, now gathered at the Hussein's front door. Whispered conversations rose and fell like waves. Who had seen her last? Who might know something? Fatima answered questions the best she could, voice shaking, hands clenching and unclenching. Each account seemed to lead nowhere, each recollection only deepening the fog. Someone suggested calling the police. The first officers to arrive were calm but efficient, trained in the protocols of missing children, a grim responsibility they understood well. Detective Harding was called in soon after. A man in his 40s, with graying hair and an ever-present crease of concentration between his brows, he approached the Hussein home like a man carrying the weight of every case he had ever handled, and those that haunted him still. His gaze swept the front yard, the sidewalk, the street, quietly cataloging what was there, and, more importantly, what wasn't. The initial interviews were painstaking. Officers spoke to neighbors in turn, asking about sightings, unusual visitors, strangers, or even small disturbances. Children were asked who they had seen the day before. Adults recalled fleeting interactions. One neighbor mentioned a man walking his dog who seemed to pause and glance toward the street where Aisha had gone. Another remembered the subtle sound of an engine idling briefly before disappearing around the corner. Each small detail was noted, filed, and cross-referenced, but none led to anything tangible. Detective Harding, quiet and methodical, went through the motions as he always did, walking the streets himself, observing, retracing Aisha's steps. The corner store was examined. Cameras weren't commonplace in that small business, and there were no surveillance tapes to review. The store owner, Mr. Thompson, described Aisha's demeanor. Cheerful, polite, eager to help. She seemed just like any other day, he said, his voice soft, tinged with concern. It was exactly that normality that gnawed at Harding. The day she vanished had been ordinary, routine, predictable, unremarkable. And yet it had ended in the inexplicable. Word of Aisha's disappearance spread quickly through the small community. Flyers were printed and posted on telephone poles, in grocery stores, and outside schools. The local radio station broadcast alerts, urging anyone with information to come forward. Families spoke in hushed tones, locking doors and keeping watch over their children, eyes darting at every passing figure. Yet, in the midst of the alarm, no lead emerged. No one had seen what had happened. No one had witnessed a struggle, a vehicle waiting, or a stranger approaching. It was as if the child had simply evaporated from the street she had walked countless times. As hours stretched into evening, the first pangs of frustration began to surface. Detective Harding walked the quiet streets alone for a moment, reviewing the collected witness statements in his mind. Each sounded credible, yet none formed a clear path forward. There was no forced entry into any nearby homes, no discarded items, no footprints in the frost that weren't explained by routine traffic. He felt the creeping sensation that would haunt him for months, the feeling that the answer was close, perhaps hiding in plain sight, but stubbornly out of reach. The Husseins, meanwhile, experienced a grief that was sharp, immediate, and raw. Fatima called every friend, family member, and neighbor she could think of, hoping for a fragment of news, a scrap of reassurance. Imran drove through the streets, stopping at intersections, searching for Aisha, for a clue, for the faintest hint of her presence. Each familiar corner, each streetlight, seemed to mock him with its normalcy. She should have been there. She should have been home. And yet, she wasn't. Community volunteers began searching nearby parks, wooded areas, and abandoned lots, calling her name into the empty spaces. The winter air swallowed the echoes of their voices. Dogs sniffed at the edges of streets and fences, yet nothing turned up. There were no signs of a vehicle, no strange tracks, nothing to suggest where she might have gone. The silence was oppressive, thickening with every hour that passed without answers. As night fell, the police set up a temporary command post at the Hussein home. Maps were pinned to walls, notes jotted on yellow pads, and phone lines buzzed with calls from concerned citizens and potential tips. Detective Harding reviewed every lead personally. He revisited the corner store, walked the route Aisha had taken, and spoke again with neighbors. One older man, Mr. Jenkins, mentioned seeing a young woman walking her dog, glancing toward Aisha's path and frowning slightly, as if she had noticed something unusual. Harding noted it, but knew it was only a small piece in a puzzle that still refused to take shape. Inside the Hussein home, the family's grief became a shared, suffocating weight. Fatima sat in the living room, clutching a small pillow to her chest, rocking slightly back and forth. Imran's hands were rough and calloused, and he ran them through his hair repeatedly, muttering fragments of prayers and pleas. There was anger there, too, not aimed at anyone specific, but at the randomness of the universe, at the cruelty of a world where a 12-year-old could vanish without explanation. In the following days, the investigation intensified. Schools were notified, local media carried stories, and neighbors recounted any faint impressions they could remember. Officers returned to the streets repeatedly, hoping that something overlooked might now reveal itself in the light of collective attention. Harding coordinated search patterns, verified witness statements, and began assembling a timeline of Aisha's last known movements. Each detail was scrutinized, but the case remained stubbornly opaque. Frustration and fear began to seep into the community. Parents walked their children to school, looked both ways twice, and monitored every interaction. Rumors floated, cars seen idling, strangers noticed in yards, small details inflated by anxiety. Harding understood the psychology of fear, knew that these details could be useful or distracting, but they all reflected a single truth. Aisha's absence had become a living wound in the neighborhood, bleeding into every household, every routine, every quiet moment. By the end of that first week, the urgency of the case began to compete with the grim realization of the unknown. Missing child cases were often resolved quickly, but Aisha's path had left no trail. The officers' notebooks were filled with observations, yet no tangible clue pointed to her whereabouts. Detective Harding sat in the hushed command post late one night, reviewing the map of her last known movements. Every street, every intersection, every yard meticulously marked, and still the pieces refused to form a picture. The Hussein family, meanwhile, oscillated between hope and despair. Every knock at the door, every phone call was a potential answer, a possibility that Aisha might be found. Every negative lead only deepened the ache. Nights became longer, filled with dreams they could not remember upon waking, haunted by the notion that she was out there somewhere, alone, unseen, waiting to be found. And so the early days ended, a mixture of frantic searching, painstaking investigation, and quiet, simmering fear. Aisha Zahra Hussein had vanished, leaving behind a trail that led nowhere. The neighborhood felt smaller, colder, more vulnerable. The ordinary rhythms of life had been disrupted, replaced by an invisible tension that clung to walls, sidewalks, and the hearts of those who still waited. Detective Harding, aware that the first days often dictated the course of a case, knew this one would test him like few others. He noted every detail, revisited every witness, and made mental checklists that stretched far into the night. Somewhere he felt the truth existed, hidden, yet attainable. But for now, all that existed was the absence, the unanswered questions, and the heavy, persistent shadow of what had begun. Months turned into years, and in the quiet corners of Fairfax County, the memory of Aisha Zahra Hussein's disappearance lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. Winter melted into spring, then summer returned, but the streets she once walked freely seemed to hold a subtle weight, a sense that something was missing, that the rhythm of ordinary life had been irrevocably altered. The corner store still stood, the sidewalk still curved predictably around trimmed hedges, but there was a tension now in the air, an invisible thread of unease woven into the daily routines of neighbors who remembered. Inside the Hussein household, life had changed in ways both tangible and unseen. Fatima's eyes, once bright and quick to laugh, now carried a dullness, a constant worry etched into the lines of her face. She kept herself busy, tending to the house, to prayers, to small errands, as if keeping the world in motion could stave off the weight of grief. Imran walked the streets of the neighborhood, visiting the places Aisha had known, searching for patterns in the familiar, hoping that if he retraced her steps enough, a fragment of truth might emerge. Their home became a repository of memories, of what-ifs, of unanswered questions. Photographs of Aisha lined the walls, smiling, laughing, ordinary moments frozen in time. Each glance at her face was a mixture of hope, longing, and unbearable sorrow. Detective Harding's involvement did not diminish. If anything, it grew sharper, more obsessive. The missing child case had become a personal fixation, the kind that burrows into one's mind, refusing to let go. In his office, the file on Aisha lay open on his desk for years, notes meticulously organized, timelines drawn, witness statements highlighted and cross-referenced. He reviewed every detail repeatedly, even when other cases demanded his attention. There was a quiet frustration in his routine, the kind that pressed on the chest, that gnawed at the mind with each passing day. How could a child disappear without a trace? How could every lead evaporate before it was fully pursued? The physical evidence, though minimal, was carefully preserved. Photos of Aisha's last known location, the corner store, the streets she frequented, even the frost patterns along the sidewalks, all documented. Witness statements lined the file, each one catalogued with precision. Forensic possibilities were explored, though the late 1990s presented limitations. DNA databases were in their infancy, fingerprint records slowed across jurisdictions, and surveillance cameras were scarce. Still, Harding noted each potential lead, each inconsistency, each whisper of memory that could someday lead to truth. Neighbors, initially mobilized in a frenzy of concern, gradually returned to the routines of their own lives, though a quiet wariness lingered. Parents no longer allowed children to walk the streets unsupervised. Children learned to look both ways, not just for cars, but for unseen danger. The ordinary familiarity of the neighborhood had been punctured, replaced by the subtle anxiety of the unknown. It was a communal grief, quiet but persistent, a reminder that the ordinary world could shift in an instant, leaving behind a vacuum of uncertainty. As the months passed, small rumors would surface: a car seen idling near the corner store, a man walking alone, a fleeting shadow at dusk. Each was investigated, noted, and ultimately led nowhere. Harding often returned to these fragments, hoping to reconstruct patterns that could yield insight, yet each attempt ended in dead ends. The frustration weighed on him as it did on the Husseins. Unlike the family, he could not grieve, could not wait in stillness. He could only act, retrace, re-examine, hoping to find that one overlooked detail that might open the case anew. The weight of time transformed the investigation itself. Files accumulated, officers rotated in and out, and the case slowly slipped from immediate urgency to a quiet, persistent presence in the background of Harding's professional life. He would occasionally sit alone in his office after long days, running his fingers over the notes, photographs, and witness recollections. "Something's here," he would murmur to himself. "Something I'm missing." And the haunting truth remained. Aisha's disappearance had become more than a case. It was a puzzle locked in silence, a life interrupted, a family suspended in grief. The Hussein family's pain evolved as well. Friends and relatives would occasionally ask about closure, about moving forward, but the idea seemed impossible. Each day was a delicate negotiation between hope and despair. Fatima often wandered into Aisha's room, touching the furniture, the books, the small toys that remained. She would trace her fingers over the pencil marks on the desk, the faint stain on the rug, remnants of ordinary childhood life that now held extraordinary absence. Imran, quieter than before, would sit on the porch late at night, staring at the street where Aisha had last been seen, reliving the moment again and again. The ache of not knowing, of being unable to act, of waiting endlessly, pressed on them like a weight too heavy to name. Harding, meanwhile, maintained his vigilance. Each year, he revisited the evidence, scanning reports, re-interviewing witnesses who might have remembered something new, something previously dismissed. Advances in forensic science were slow, but he noted them: DNA analysis becoming more refined, fingerprint databases expanding, techniques improving. Though constrained by the time period, Harding catalogued each potential tool, quietly anticipating the day when science might allow him to reach into the past and pull the truth into the present. Community interest fluctuated with time. News outlets occasionally revisited the case, brief segments highlighting missing children, warnings about stranger danger, appeals for any information. The public's attention was fleeting, yet Harding and the Husseins remained anchored in their vigil. The town had learned, the neighborhood had learned, that life could shift abruptly, and that the ordinary safety of their streets was never guaranteed. During these years, subtle hints began to emerge that would later prove pivotal. Neighbors sometimes remarked on the behavior of certain individuals: a man who walked alone, someone who rarely interacted with the community, someone whose patterns were predictable yet isolatable. These observations, initially dismissed as coincidence or curiosity, would later converge into critical insight. But for now, they remained whispers, almost unnoticed, faint shadows against the backdrop of grief and frustration. In the Hussein household, the emotional toll was compounded by the lack of resolution. Every small movement of the neighborhood, every unexplained sound, every passerby prompted a flinch of hope or dread. Fatima carried a small notebook, writing down each detail she noticed. A way to impose some order on chaos, a method to keep a semblance of control over a world that had become unpredictable. Imran began documenting patterns as well, marking the times Aisha would usually walk past the corner, the routines she followed, the people she interacted with. Together, they constructed a fragile map of memory, a mental retracing that held the only semblance of agency they could grasp. As years stretched on, Detective Harding continued to carry the case with him. New officers joined the department, some curious, some skeptical, yet Harding remained steadfast. Every lead was examined, every rumor investigated. He quietly held on to the possibility that someone, somewhere, knew something. Somewhere, the truth existed, buried, hidden, waiting for the right convergence of courage and evidence to bring it to light. And then, 10 months after Aisha disappeared, something began to shift. Not in the streets, not in the neighborhood, but within the walls of a quiet household nearby. A stepsister noticed a small, unsettling detail. A piece of tissue, stained, discarded carelessly in the backyard. The soil around it was disturbed, as if someone had been digging. Alone and fearful, she waited for the right moment. When her stepbrother left for his routine shopping trip, she dug carefully into the soft earth and uncovered a glimpse of a truth that had eluded the authorities for nearly a year. That single act, quiet and determined, set in motion the events that would finally unravel the case. It was the tip of a thread that would pull together years of grief, frustration, and unanswered questions into a chain of discovery, leading to confrontation, confession, and closure. But at this stage, it was only a hint, a whisper, a shadow of the truth waiting to emerge. The weight of 10 months of silence had fallen on the Husseins and the community. And yet hope, fragile but persistent, had begun to stir once more, unremarked, unnoticed, but unstoppable in its eventual impact. The winter air had given way to the restless stirrings of early spring when Sarah first noticed something that didn't belong. Her stepbrother Mark lived a quiet, predictable life, mostly solitary. He left the house every evening after returning from the bar, taking long walks through the neighborhood, returning without incident. He had a clean record, polite enough to maintain the facade of normalcy, and no one would have suspected him of the darkness hidden behind his ordinary routines. But Sarah had always sensed subtle oddities in his behavior, small things, easily dismissed by others. That afternoon, she saw something undeniable. She had been tending to the backyard, sweeping fallen leaves and debris from the winter months, when her eyes caught a flash of white. A small piece of tissue, partially buried in the damp soil, stained with something dark enough to make her stomach twist. Her heart jumped, a jolt of recognition that she couldn't explain. She stared for a long moment, forcing herself to breathe steadily, to rationalize, to convince herself it was nothing, a stain from a garden accident, perhaps. But the soil around it told a different story. There were signs of recent disturbance. Clumps of dirt turned over as if someone had been digging in the shadows. Sarah's mind raced. She knew her stepbrother's habits. He had been out for hours, and the timing made her realize that the dig was recent. She looked around the backyard, noting every detail. Footprints in the damp earth, the uneven patches of grass, the small indentations that suggested something had been hidden and then covered again. Fear gripped her, cold and unrelenting, but alongside it rose something stronger. Determination. She could not ignore this. She had to act. When Mark left the house later for his routine shopping trip, Sarah seized the moment. Hands shaking, heart pounding. She grabbed a small spade from the shed and began to dig into the soil. Each scoop of earth was careful, precise, almost reverent, as if the act itself could summon the truth into the open. The smell of damp earth rose to her nostrils, mingling with something metallic, something unmistakably wrong. And then, beneath the thin layer of topsoil, she saw it. A fragment of something that confirmed her worst fears. She pulled it free, careful not to touch more than necessary, and stepped back, breathing unevenly, the enormity of what she had found pressing down on her chest. For a long moment, Sarah simply stared at what lay before her. She was a stepsister, not a detective, not trained in forensics, but instinct and fear demanded action. She knew that calling the police was the only option, that the moment she reported this, everything would change. With a mix of trepidation and resolve, she dialed 911, her voice trembling as she described what she had found, giving precise details, pleading for officers to arrive quickly. Within the hour, Detective Harding and his team were at the scene. The backyard, once quiet and unremarkable, now became the epicenter of careful, methodical investigation. Officers cordoned off the area, preserving the evidence, taking photographs, cataloging each disturbed patch of soil. Harding's expression was unreadable, a mask of concentration hiding the mixture of anticipation and grim understanding he felt whenever a missing child case began to reveal itself after months of silence. The discovery sent shockwaves through the Hussein household. Fatima and Imran, still suspended in grief and uncertainty, were brought to the scene cautiously. The moment they saw what had been uncovered, the reality of the situation struck with a force that words could not convey. Detective Harding gently explained the process. The evidence needed to be handled meticulously. The forensic team would need time, and nothing would be rushed. Fatima clutched Imran's arm, her eyes wide and brimming with tears, emotions too raw to name. As the excavation continued, officers carefully unearthed the remnants of what had been hidden, working with precision and quiet respect. The soil yielded small fragments, carefully collected and placed in evidence bags, catalogued and sent for immediate analysis. Each piece, each fiber, each trace had the potential to illuminate the path that had remained hidden for nearly a year. Harding observed silently, noting every detail, thinking through timelines, calculating possibilities, and considering the psychological profile that could explain the actions leading up to this moment. Sarah remained nearby, a silent observer, her fear mingled with a sense of responsibility. She had been the catalyst for this breakthrough, yet she understood the gravity of the situation. Her stepbrother, whom she had known for years, could no longer be hidden behind normalcy. She realized that in this quiet neighborhood, in this ordinary house, a hidden horror had been living alongside them. Her courage had illuminated the path, but the road ahead would be harrowing. Demanding the full attention of detectives, forensic specialists, and the community that had been holding its collective breath. Detective Harding approached Sarah quietly. "You did the right thing," he said softly, careful to convey reassurance without minimizing the weight of the discovery. "This, what you found, it's the key. We'll handle the rest, but it starts with you." Her eyes met his, a mixture of relief and lingering fear, understanding that her action had set in motion a series of events that would finally demand accountability, truth, and resolution. Over the next several hours, forensic teams worked meticulously. Each fragment of evidence was catalogued. Soil samples, tissue fragments, fibers. They were careful, precise, following the procedures that would ensure the integrity of the investigation. Harding coordinated with laboratories, sending materials for immediate testing. The air, once filled with normal domestic sounds, now carried the quiet tension of urgency, the low hum of engines, the careful footsteps of investigators moving deliberately, aware that the next hours could alter everything. The neighborhood watched from a respectful distance, whispers of recognition and fear mingling with speculation. No one fully understood what was happening, but the presence of police, the excavation of a quiet backyard, the hushed instructions and gestures of officers. It was unmistakably serious. Families kept children inside, windows closed, doors locked, as if the act of observing might somehow draw danger closer. For the Husseins, the long months of waiting and uncertainty were crystallizing into a moment of reckoning, a confrontation with reality that had been deferred for too long. By evening, preliminary results from the forensic team confirmed the initial fears. Biological evidence collected from the backyard suggested a direct link to Aisha's disappearance. DNA analysis, painstaking and precise, would later confirm the connection, providing scientific verification of the long-suspected truth. Harding, though experienced and measured, allowed himself a quiet sigh. The breakthrough had finally arrived, the invisible thread of months and years now tangible in the evidence laid out before him. The next step was inevitable: locating Mark and initiating a formal investigation. Officers moved with care, aware of the potential for confrontation, aware of the psychological implications of the arrest for the family and the community. Harding reviewed the timelines, rehearsing the questioning, considering the most effective approach to elicit truthful responses while preserving evidence and ensuring safety. Meanwhile, Sarah, still trembling from the day's events, returned to the house briefly to collect herself, then left to stay with a friend, ensuring that she would not be present during the confrontation that was about to unfold. Her role as the informant was critical, yet she understood that the process required distance, patience, and reliance on the authorities to carry the investigation forward. The night settled in with a tense quiet. The backyard, once an ordinary stretch of grass and soil, now held the weight of truth waiting to be fully revealed. Harding walked the perimeter once more, cataloging, observing, and mentally preparing for the next steps. He understood the gravity of what had been uncovered, the emotional and procedural complexities, and the responsibility that now rested on the investigator's shoulders. For the Hussein family, the moment was bittersweet. Relief, tentative and fragile, mingled with renewed grief. The long months of uncertainty, the endless waiting, and the haunting absence of their daughter had culminated in a discovery that promised truth but could not undo the trauma. Fatima whispered prayers of thanks, tears streaming silently, while Imran stood stoically, absorbing the moment with quiet intensity, aware that the journey toward resolution was only beginning. And so, the story that had begun in the ordinary rhythm of a winter morning now entered a new phase. One where the hidden horror would be confronted, the long months of unanswered questions would begin to find answers, and the community, the investigators, and the family would all bear witness to the unraveling of a decade-long shadow. Mark returned from his routine shopping trip that evening, unaware that the small disturbance in his backyard had set in motion the unraveling of everything he had hidden. He carried the familiar weight of normalcy, a clean criminal record, polite greetings to neighbors, and a solitary routine that never invited suspicion. To anyone watching from outside, he was just another quiet man in the neighborhood, alone with his habits, harmless and unremarkable. But inside that ordinary exterior, a truth darker than anyone could imagine had been waiting to be uncovered. As Mark entered the house, the sound of police radios and muffled instructions reached his ears. At first, confusion crossed his face. He glanced toward the backyard and noticed the scene of officers, the cordoned-off area, and the gloved hands working methodically in the soil. Something tightened in his chest, a fleeting panic, quickly masked by practiced calm. He set down his shopping bags and moved toward the door, feigning curiosity and casual engagement, a mask he had worn for years. Detective Harding approached him carefully, noting the man's posture, the tension in his jaw, and the subtle way he avoided direct eye contact. "Mark," Harding said, voice measured and firm, "we need to speak with you about Aisha Hussein." The name hit like a hammer, carrying with it months of frustration, grief, and an entire community's concern. Mark froze for a split second, the familiar calm fracturing, but he quickly composed himself, offering a polite nod. "Of course, Detective," he replied, voice steady, though just beneath the surface, unease churned. Officers guided Mark into the living room, ensuring the integrity of the evidence outside remained uncompromised. Every step he took was observed, every movement catalogued. Harding spoke carefully, explaining that this was a formal questioning, that they needed his cooperation to clarify timelines and movements from the day of Aisha's disappearance to the present. Mark, maintaining his air of normalcy, responded to each question with apparent calm. He described his routines, his walks, his interactions at the bar, his solitary habits. He offered no hints, no slips, only the practiced rhythm of a man accustomed to routine. Meanwhile, forensic teams continued their work in the backyard. Every fragment of soil, every fiber, every trace discovered by Sarah was carefully collected and documented. Photographs were taken from multiple angles. DNA swabs were applied meticulously, catalogued with precise labeling, sealed in evidence bags, and sent immediately to the laboratory. Officers moved deliberately, understanding that this evidence could break the case wide open, provide the unassailable scientific link needed to confirm suspicions long held in quiet desperation. The tension in the household was palpable. Sarah watched from a safe distance, anxiety mingling with anticipation. She knew what she had discovered was critical, yet the act of confronting the man she had called a stepbrother now felt weighty and surreal. Fatima and Imran were present, quiet observers, aware that the next hours could redefine everything, that the facade of normalcy could shatter, revealing truths they had long feared. Detective Harding reviewed the initial findings from the backyard excavation. There were multiple soil samples consistent with recent disturbance, fibers matching materials from Aisha's clothing, and traces of biological matter that suggested a violent act had occurred. These findings were preliminary, but compelling. Harding's mind worked through each possibility: timelines, opportunity, motives. He spoke with his team quietly, carefully outlining next steps, ensuring that every procedure followed would withstand the scrutiny of forensic examination and, eventually, the courtroom. Mark, still seated in the living room, maintained an almost eerie calm. He answered questions, recounted routines, and provided plausible explanations for his movements. But as the forensic team worked outside, Harding could see subtle cracks in his demeanor. A fleeting glance toward the backyard, a tightening of the jaw, a pause in speech, small, almost imperceptible, but noted by the trained eye. Harding filed them away mentally, aware that while Mark's behavior was outwardly controlled, the weight of the investigation had begun to encroach upon the mask he had worn for years. As night descended, Harding arranged for a more formal collection of samples from Mark himself: hair, skin swabs, and other evidence that could be cross-referenced with what had been found in the disturbed backyard. Officers followed procedure meticulously, ensuring consent and proper documentation. The tension in the room was tangible, a quiet pressure that pressed against every participant. Mark complied, maintaining polite speech, though the smallest signs of discomfort betrayed the cracks beneath his exterior. Outside, the forensic team continued the painstaking excavation. Each scoop of earth revealed new fragments, fibers, small traces of what appeared to be biological material, and soil samples that could be matched to locations within the house. The process was slow, deliberate, and respectful, every action mindful of the gravity of the discovery. Harding moved among the team, observing, instructing, and mentally piecing together a timeline that now included physical confirmation of the events that had been hidden for nearly a year. Detective Harding also took the opportunity to interview Sarah in greater detail. Her account was critical. The moment she noticed the tissue, the disturbed earth, the timing of Mark's departure for his shopping trip, and the precise sequence that led her to uncover evidence. Her testimony was recorded carefully, noting every detail that could corroborate the physical evidence being gathered. Sarah's courage was undeniable, and Harding made sure to acknowledge it, aware that her actions had created the breakthrough necessary to move the case forward. By the end of the night, the backyard had been thoroughly examined, evidence carefully packaged, and Mark formally held for questioning pending analysis results. Harding reviewed the procedures with his team, ensuring that nothing was overlooked, that every piece of evidence could be accounted for in court. The investigation had reached a critical juncture. The ordinary man, who had lived unnoticed among the community, was now squarely within the scope of law enforcement scrutiny. Mark's demeanor began to shift subtly as the hours passed. The initial calm gave way to small signs of tension. A finger drumming against his leg, brief pauses mid-sentence, fleeting glances toward the window and the now empty backyard. Harding noted them all, aware that these were early indicators of psychological strain. While outwardly polite, Mark had never anticipated the meticulous scientific and methodical approach that would now expose the truth. In the Hussein household, the mix of relief and fear was complex. Fatima and Imran could sense that progress had been made, yet the weight of what it implied pressed upon them. For nearly a year, they had lived in limbo, caught between hope and despair. Now the investigation had pierced the uncertainty, revealing that the truth they had long sought was close, and yet horrifying in its implications. By the early hours of the morning, the forensic lab had begun preliminary tests on the collected materials. DNA analysis, though not yet complete, suggested potential matches that would confirm suspicions. Fibers were compared to Aisha's last known clothing. Soil samples were cross-referenced with areas inside the home and the backyard. Each test added a new layer of evidence, constructing an irrefutable bridge between the disappearance, the disturbed backyard, and the man who had lived an ordinary, unsuspected life. Harding, seated in his office late into the night, reviewed all the collected data. Every statement, every physical sample, every subtle observation of Mark's behavior was catalogued and considered. The breakthrough was undeniable. The case that had lain dormant for months now had a path forward, a route from suspicion to undeniable truth. For the first time since Aisha's disappearance, the threads of the story were aligning. Outside, the neighborhood remained quiet, unaware of the seismic shift that had occurred within one ordinary backyard. Officers maintained a presence, cordoning off the area, ensuring that nothing could disturb the fragile but critical evidence. Harding allowed himself a brief moment to reflect. The quiet courage of a stepsister, the persistence of months of methodical investigation, and the inexorable logic of forensic science had converged to pierce a darkness that had remained hidden for too long. For the Hussein family, for the investigators, and for the community, the sense of imminent resolution was bittersweet. The evidence confirmed that Aisha's disappearance was not random, not accidental. The ordinary man among them had hidden an unspeakable crime. And now, with the physical proof gathered, the next steps, confrontation, confession, and ultimately justice, could begin. The interrogation room was quiet, almost oppressively so. Its walls, pale and unadorned, reflected the harsh fluorescent light above, creating a clinical, unforgiving atmosphere. Mark sat across from Detective Harding, his posture rigid, hands folded on the table. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper, a sterile contrast to the chaos that was about to erupt. For months, Mark had maintained a life of ordinary routine, solitary walks after returning from the bar, polite interactions with neighbors, a clean criminal record. He had hidden in plain sight. And now, faced with the evidence gathered from his own backyard, his facade was beginning to crack. Detective Harding approached the questioning with deliberate calm. Years of experience had taught him that patience often yielded more than force. He did not begin with accusations, nor did he reveal the full weight of the forensic findings immediately. Instead, he led with facts, timelines, locations, small inconsistencies in Mark's routine. "Mark," he said, voice steady, "we've reviewed your movements over the past year. We've spoken to neighbors, reviewed statements, and carefully analyzed every piece of evidence from the scene you know as your backyard." He paused, letting the words settle. "I want to hear your account. I want to understand what happened." Mark's eyes flicked toward the table, briefly avoiding Harding's gaze. He nodded slowly, lips pressed together. I don't know what you're referring to," he said, calm on the surface, but Harding detected the tremor underneath, the subtle hesitation that spoke volumes. Harding leaned forward slightly, voice low but insistent. "Mark, we recovered evidence in your backyard, biological material, fibers, soil, all consistent with the disappearance of Aisha Zahra Hussein. We have witnesses, timelines, and a clear chain of custody. The forensic lab is confirming DNA analysis right now." He allowed the pause to expand, emphasizing the certainty of the truth. "This isn't speculation. We know it's you." For a long moment, Mark said nothing. His fingers drummed lightly against the table, and his jaw tightened. Then, almost imperceptibly, his shoulders slumped, the air leaving his chest in a slow, shuddering exhale. Harding recognized the moment, the first crack in the mask, the subtle admission of defeat. "You don't have to say anything yet," Harding continued gently, "but the evidence is clear. DNA matches, fibers, soil. We've catalogued everything meticulously. The truth is here, Mark. We can prove it scientifically." The room was still, the only sound the faint hum of the fluorescent light. The air seemed heavier, as if pressing down on everyone present. Mark's face paled, his eyes darted toward the door briefly, then back to Harding, realizing that escape was impossible. He swallowed hard, lips trembling. I didn't mean for it to happen," he whispered, voice barely audible. I didn't know how it happened." The words were fragmented, confessional, a mixture of fear, shame, and resignation. Harding remained still, letting Mark speak, understanding that the confession would come in pieces, each piece revealing the hidden, unthinkable acts of the previous months. Over the next hour, Harding guided Mark through the timeline, carefully reconstructing the events in a manner that preserved both clarity and precision for later court proceedings. Mark revealed the sequence of abduction, the manipulation, and the concealment. His confession, fragmented yet coherent, aligned with the forensic evidence, confirming the horrifying reality. Aisha had been taken, harmed, and hidden within the confines of a backyard that seemed ordinary to the casual observer. DNA confirmation arrived shortly thereafter. The forensic lab, using state-of-the-art methods, verified that biological samples recovered from the backyard and remaining traces were an exact match to Aisha Zahra Hussain. The scientific verification left no room for doubt. Harding reviewed the report meticulously, noting the exact matches, cross-referencing fibers, and cataloging every detail. The incontrovertible evidence provided a foundation not only for the arrest but also for eventual prosecution. Mark's demeanor shifted further as the weight of undeniable proof settled in. The initial panic had evolved into resignation, a quiet, almost robotic acknowledgement of what was now unavoidable. He no longer attempted to deny involvement, no longer crafted the careful stories he had used to conceal the crime for months. The evidence, both physical and testimonial, had stripped away the ordinary man's mask, revealing the reality hidden behind years of routine and solitude. The interrogation continued into the night. Harding's approach remained calm, methodical. He allowed Mark to recount details, guiding the conversation with precision. Every fact confirmed another element of the case. Every detail matched with collected evidence. The soil patterns, fibers, fragments of tissue, and the location of each disturbed area in the backyard. It was a meticulous reconstruction, a chillingly precise puzzle, piece by piece. Sarah's earlier actions, noticing the tissue, observing the disturbed earth, digging carefully while her stepbrother was away, proved crucial. Without her bravery, the breakthrough might have taken years longer. Harding documented her account in full, ensuring that her observations aligned with the forensic record. Her courage had pierced a silence that had haunted the Hussains and the community for months. Fatima and Imran were notified as the interrogation concluded. The news was delivered with care. The man who had hidden behind the guise of ordinary life had confessed. The DNA evidence confirmed the identity of the victim, and the narrative of the crime was now coherent. Their reactions were complex. Relief mingled with sorrow, hope tempered by grief. The long months of uncertainty, the endless waiting, and the persistent ache of unanswered questions were finally met with clarity. Clarity that was as painful as it was necessary. The community, upon learning of the confession, experienced a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a grim acknowledgement of the truth. A man who had seemed unremarkable, ordinary, and unassuming had carried out unspeakable acts in plain view. Neighbors recounted his solitary habits, his polite but distant demeanor, reflecting on the subtle signs that had gone unnoticed. The ordinary rhythms of the neighborhood had masked something horrific, leaving the community to grapple with the realization that evil can exist behind familiar faces. Harding prepared the case for prosecution with meticulous care. Every detail from the interrogation, the forensic evidence, Sarah's testimony, and the timeline of Mark's routine was documented and verified. The confession, corroborated by science, provided an unassailable foundation for the trial. Harding felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, not of triumph, but of justice achieved. The evidence would now speak in the courtroom, ensuring that the months of investigation, the grief of the family, and the bravery of Sarah would not be in vain. Mark remained in custody, the full reality of his actions settling over him, like a weight he could no longer escape. The ordinary man who had walked freely among neighbors, whose habits seemed benign, was now fully exposed. His life of quiet routine, polite greetings, and solitary walks had masked the depths of his crime, but it could no longer protect him. The law, meticulous and patient, had caught up, and the truth was undeniable. In the Hussain household, life began the slow, tentative process of reckoning. Aisha's absence remained, but the certainty of her fate allowed for grieving with knowledge, rather than uncertainty. Fatima and Imran, while still devastated, could begin to reconcile with the reality that had haunted them for nearly a year. The long months of unanswered questions were finally met with the truth that, while painful, offered closure and the possibility of eventual healing. Detective Harding, reflecting on the case, recognized the convergence of factors that had led to resolution: careful observation, relentless investigation, meticulous forensic work, and the courage of a witness willing to act despite fear. The ordinary man, hidden in plain sight, had been brought to account, demonstrating the power of persistence, science, and moral courage in the pursuit of justice. And so, nearly a year after Aisha Zahra Hussein had vanished into the ordinary rhythms of Fairfax County, the case that had haunted a family, a community, and a detective reached its critical turning point. Confession and scientific proof had pierced the veil of silence, revealing the hidden truth, and setting in motion the steps that would lead to prosecution, accountability, and, for the first time since her disappearance, the beginning of closure. The courtroom was quiet, the atmosphere heavy with anticipation. Months of preparation, meticulous evidence collection, and painstaking forensic analysis had led to this moment. Mark, once the ordinary man who had walked unseen through the streets of Fairfax County, now sat at the defendant's table, his calm veneer replaced by a subtle tension, the weight of his actions pressing visibly on his shoulders. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and paper, the air charged with a mixture of sorrow, anger, and the anticipation of justice finally arriving. Detective Harding sat among the officers in the gallery, reviewing notes one last time. The case had unfolded over nearly a year, from Aisha Zahra Hussein's disappearance in 1999 to the courageous discovery by Sarah, to the painstaking collection of evidence and eventual confession. Everything led to this courtroom. Every fiber, every soil sample, every piece of testimony had been verified and cross-referenced. Harding knew the strength of the case, but he also understood the emotional weight it carried. The Husseins were here, seated quietly, their faces taut with grief, their hands intertwined. This was their moment to witness not just justice, but the reckoning of nearly a year of uncertainty, fear, and loss. The trial began with opening statements that laid the foundation of the case. The prosecution carefully detailed the sequence of events: Aisha's disappearance, the months of searching and unanswered questions, Sarah's discovery in the backyard, the forensic evidence that linked Mark to the crime, and finally, his confession. Each element was presented with precision, emphasizing the methodical, undeniable logic that had brought the case to this point. The courtroom listened, captivated and horrified in equal measure, as the ordinary man behind polite routines was revealed as the orchestrator of an unimaginable crime. Witnesses were called in sequence. Sarah, trembling but resolute, recounted the day she had discovered the tissue, noticed the disturbed soil, and decided to act despite her fear. Her voice quavered at first, but as she described the careful excavation, the moment the realization struck her, and her immediate call to the police, it gained strength. Harding noted the quiet bravery in her testimony, the moral courage that had illuminated the darkness hidden in plain sight. The jury, the court, and even the spectators were struck by the courage of a stepsister who had acted decisively despite fear and uncertainty. Forensic experts followed, presenting DNA evidence with careful scientific precision. Samples from the backyard, fibers from Aisha's clothing, and traces of biological material collected from soil and tissue were systematically laid out. Each analysis, each match, each methodical step reinforced the story already told. The evidence was irrefutable. DNA from Mark matched samples recovered from the crime scene, confirming both the abduction and harm inflicted upon Aisha. Fiber analysis corroborated her clothing's presence in the backyard, and the timeline of soil disturbance aligned precisely with Mark's routines and movements. The courtroom was silent, every detail delivered with calm authority, a meticulous weaving of fact and science into a narrative that left no room for doubt. Mark's attorney attempted to challenge the evidence, questioning the handling of samples and the interpretation of forensic results. But Harding, the forensic team, and the prosecution countered with detailed documentation of chain of custody, procedural integrity, and scientific reliability. Each challenge was addressed, dismantled, and contextualized, further fortifying the undeniable link between Mark and the crime. Slowly, the sense of disbelief among the jurors gave way to a grim understanding. The ordinary man in their community had committed an extraordinary evil. The defense also explored Mark's character, emphasizing his solitary lifestyle, his polite demeanor, and lack of previous criminal record. Yet the weight of scientific evidence, Sarah's courageous testimony, and the confession he had given months earlier proved insurmountable. The courtroom became a space where the ordinary and the horrific collided. A man whose daily habits had seemed innocuous now faced the full consequence of his hidden actions. Throughout the trial, the Hussein family remained composed, though their grief was palpable. Fatima's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes tracing every movement, every exchange, every piece of evidence, as if memorizing it in preparation for some internal reckoning. Imran's stoicism was quiet but intense, his gaze fixed on Mark whenever he was present in the room. They bore witness not only to the legal process, but to the unearthing of the truth that had haunted them for nearly a year. The closing statements crystallized the narrative. The prosecution summarized months of investigation, careful observation, and scientific rigor. They emphasized the courage of Sarah, the meticulous work of the forensic teams, and the moral responsibility of holding Mark accountable. They reminded the jury of the human cost: a young girl taken from her family, the persistent grief endured, the shattered sense of safety in a community once familiar and predictable. The defense offered their final plea, yet the weight of evidence, combined with Mark's own confession, left little room for doubt or mitigation. After deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict that seemed inevitable, yet carried profound emotional weight. Guilty on all counts. The words resonated through the courtroom, confirming what months of investigation had meticulously proven. Mark's shoulders slumped further, the facade of normalcy completely dissolved. Harding allowed himself a quiet sigh of relief. The long months of methodical work, the sleepless nights, and the emotional investment had culminated in justice. For the Hussein family, the verdict was both a relief and a burden. The confirmation that Aisha's disappearance had been an intentional act brought closure, yet it also crystallized the horror of what had been done to their child. Fatima wept quietly, tears mingling with the faint smile of relief that justice had been served. Imran held her hand, sharing in both sorrow and validation. The months of waiting, the grief, and the unrelenting uncertainty had finally been met with the recognition of truth. The community responded with a mixture of shock and tentative solace. The revelation that an ordinary neighbor had perpetrated such a crime challenged their sense of safety. Yet the thoroughness of the investigation and the accountability imposed offered reassurance. Parents remained vigilant, children stayed close, and the ordinary routines of the neighborhood resumed with a cautious mindfulness. But the story of Aisha Zahra Hussein, her life, her disappearance, and the subsequent resolution, became a touchstone, a reminder of both the fragility of ordinary life and the power of courage, science, and persistence in seeking justice. Mark was sentenced to life imprisonment, ensuring that he would never again walk freely among the community he had terrorized. The sentence provided legal closure, but the emotional and psychological healing for the Hussein family and the broader community would take far longer. Harding, reflecting on the case, noted that the convergence of human courage, scientific innovation, and dogged investigation had made the difference. Without Sarah's bravery, the meticulous forensic work, and the relentless pursuit of truth, the case might have remained unresolved, a lingering shadow over Fairfax County. In the months following the trial, the Hussein family began the slow process of rebuilding their lives. Their home, once a place of quiet dread, became a space for remembrance, for memory, and eventually for tentative hope. They created small rituals to honor Aisha. Photographs, flowers, and moments of reflection that allowed them to integrate grief into the fabric of daily life. They spoke occasionally with the media, emphasizing the importance of vigilance, the courage of witnesses, and the unyielding necessity of justice. Detective Harding continued to work in the Fairfax County Police Department, his approach to missing child cases forever shaped by the lessons learned in this investigation. The combination of meticulous observation, methodical evidence collection, and patient, careful interrogation became a benchmark for future investigations. Harding's quiet dedication to Aisha's case had ensured that her story would not be forgotten. that the ordinary man who committed extraordinary harm would face accountability, and that a family's grief would not remain unanswered. And so, the long shadow of 10 months finally lifted. The ordinary streets of Fairfax County resumed their rhythms. Children played, neighbors greeted each other, and life moved forward. Yet the memory of Aisha Zahra Hussain lingered, a testament to the fragility of innocence, the courage of witnesses, and the enduring necessity of truth. Justice, achieved through science, courage, and human perseverance, allowed the community to confront the darkness that had hidden among them, ensuring that the story of one young girl's life, her disappearance, and the resolution of her case would remain a poignant reminder of both tragedy and triumph. The weeks after the trial brought a strange, tentative calm to Fairfax County. The ordinary rhythms of daily life slowly resumed, yet the shadow of Aisha Zahra Hussein's story lingered, a quiet, persistent reminder that beneath the surface of familiarity, darkness can hide. For the Hussein family, the verdict and Mark's sentencing offered relief, yet it did not erase grief. Fatima would often sit quietly in the living room, gazing at photographs of Isha, her fingers tracing the edges of memories, lingering on moments both ordinary and extraordinary. Her laughter at a small joke, the way she tucked her hair behind her ears, the shy smile that would light her face when someone complimented her art. Each memory was vivid, sacred, and bittersweet. Imran, similarly, moved through days with careful intent. He returned to his work, but there was a new weight in his movements, an awareness that the world could contain both profound kindness and unimaginable cruelty. Yet he drew strength from the knowledge that justice had been served. That knowledge, though incomplete in healing the void left by Aisha's absence, provided a foundation for resilience, a base upon which the family could slowly rebuild life. Sarah, the stepsister whose courage had shattered the silence surrounding Aisha's disappearance, experienced a different kind of reckoning. Her bravery had been the catalyst, the moment when fear was transformed into decisive action. She struggled initially with the weight of what she had uncovered, the horror of realizing the crime had occurred so close to home, the dissonance of loving someone who had perpetrated such harm. Therapy and support helped, gradually allowing her to reconcile the courage it took to act with the enduring trauma of the discovery. Her role became quietly celebrated, a reminder that moral courage can reside in ordinary people, sometimes in the most unexpected places. Detective Harding, whose meticulous persistence had guided the investigation from a cold file to courtroom resolution, reflected often on the case. It had changed him, not because of victory, but because of the profound lessons in human behavior, resilience, and the fragility of life. He had spent years solving crimes, but Aisha's case was different. It demanded patience, empathy, and careful attention to detail, and it demonstrated that even in cases that seem hopeless, breakthroughs can emerge from courage, observation, and methodical investigation. Harding carried the lessons forward, mentoring younger officers, sharing the story of perseverance, and emphasizing the importance of never dismissing a detail, no matter how small. In the community, the impact was profound, yet subtle. Parents spoke more openly with their children, aware that ordinary appearances could mask danger. Neighborhood watch programs gained renewed interest, not merely as precautionary measures, but as a communal assertion of vigilance and responsibility. Schools introduced discussions on safety and awareness, emphasizing the importance of speaking up when something feels wrong. The ordinary streets, once tranquil and predictable, now held a lingering consciousness, a collective memory of how hidden evil can exist in plain sight, and how the courage of a single witness can illuminate truth. Forensic science and investigative methodology also benefited. The case demonstrated the critical role of precise evidence collection, DNA analysis, and the integration of observational testimony. The combination of meticulous forensic work and moral courage had cracked a case that, for months, had seemed frozen in uncertainty. The methods employed became case studies, not merely for procedural correctness, but as exemplars of how scientific precision and human bravery converged to deliver justice. Fatima and Imran began to create rituals of remembrance, small acts that integrated Aisha's presence into the fabric of daily life. They planted a small garden in her memory, flowers that bloomed in spring and summer, reminders of both fragility and resilience. Friends and community members visited, sharing stories of Aisha's kindness, intelligence, and laughter. These acts were small but profoundly meaningful, a way to assert life and memory in the face of what had once seemed senseless. Mark's absence, of course, remained a stark reality. The ordinary man who had walked among neighbors, who had maintained polite routines, now existed solely as a cautionary tale and a legal precedent. His life, once predictable and unnoticed, had become a study in deception and hidden cruelty. In court and in custody, his actions were dissected, analyzed, and memorialized in the public record. A grim, unflinching reminder that justice, though delayed, can eventually hold even the most ordinary perpetrators accountable. The case also left an imprint on the younger generation in the community. Children, initially shielded from the details, gradually learned through age-appropriate discussions about vigilance, trust, and courage. Teachers and counselors emphasized the importance of speaking up, noticing subtle signs of danger, and understanding that even people who appear normal may have hidden depths. These lessons, though born of tragedy, helped shape a generation more aware, cautious, and empowered to act when faced with uncertainty. Years later, when Harding recounted the investigation to new officers or community groups, he focused not on the horror, but on the convergence of factors that brought resolution. The courage to act, the meticulous attention to detail, the patience to follow small leads, and the scientific verification that made denial impossible. He emphasized the importance of listening, observing, and trusting both instinct and evidence. In every retelling, the central lesson remained: justice requires persistence, integrity, and a willingness to confront even the most uncomfortable truths. For the Husseins, life became a delicate balance of memory and forward motion. Their grief never vanished, but it evolved, taking the shape of quiet remembrance, acts of kindness in Aisha's honor, and a commitment to raising awareness about safety and vigilance. They spoke occasionally at community events, sharing the story of courage, resilience, and the critical importance of speaking up. Their voices, soft yet resolute, inspired others to act when confronted with uncertainty, to trust their instincts, and to understand that even a single act of bravery can illuminate hidden truths. The case of Aisha Zahra Hussein, though steeped in sorrow, ultimately became a testament to the power of human action, science, and persistence. It demonstrated that even in ordinary lives, extraordinary courage can emerge, that ordinary people can make the difference between unresolved grief and justice, and that hidden darkness, no matter how well concealed, can be exposed through careful observation and moral resolve. As time passed, the neighborhood slowly returned to its quiet rhythms. Children played in the streets, families went about daily routines, and the ordinary life Harding, the Husseins, and the community had known began to reassert itself. Yet the story of Aisha remained, a quiet, unyielding presence in the collective memory. Flowers bloomed where her garden had been planted, photographs adorned walls, and memories of laughter, kindness, and vibrancy persisted, ensuring that her life, though tragically cut short, was not forgotten. The ultimate legacy was profound: the interplay of ordinary and extraordinary, courage and fear, science and human intuition, grief and justice. Aisha's story reminded everyone involved that even in the darkest of circumstances, truth can emerge, bravery can shine, and accountability, when pursued with diligence and moral courage, can restore a measure of peace to those left behind. And so, the quiet streets of Fairfax County carried forward, ordinary in appearance, yet forever changed. Aisha Zahra Hussein's life, her disappearance, and the ultimate resolution of her case became an enduring lesson. One that intertwined grief with hope, horror with courage, and absence with remembrance. In the hearts of her family, the vigilance of the community, and the practices of law enforcement, the story persisted as a beacon. Even when evil hides in plain sight, truth, bravery, and justice can prevail.